Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our wonderful Faculty of Architecture in the Built Environment. The sun is shining, so nice that you are here today on this wonderful topic on landscape-based solutions for biocultural diversity. Later I'm going to explain actually what we mean by that. But of course, we are very happy to welcome Julia Watson. Please give her a hand for a beautiful keynote lecture, and I think her work is of inspiration for many of us. So I'm really excited to have you here and to see your presentation. Yeah, today, so my name is Steffen Nijhuis. I'm the chair of landscape architecture here in Delft, but I'm also a full professor in landscape-based urbanism, which is actually about using the landscape as a formative element in urbanization processes. And of course, traditional knowledge, landscape-based solutions play a crucial role in there. And I'm very happy to be able to organize this event together with Partners for Water, Liliana Geerling. So thank you very much for helping us out. And we have a long collaboration on this topic already, as I will explain also a little bit later. So the program is actually quite straightforward. I will give a short introduction into the topic. Then, of course, we will give the floor to Julia. And then afterwards, there will be a panel discussion. Liliana will take the lead in that, together with Julia, but also my dear colleagues Inge Bobbink and Tilly. And of course, you also as an audience will be part of that. And then afterwards, we will have some drinks and lunch. So I think that is also a very good part of the program. Well, I hope so. Yeah. But my secretary, I know my secretary very well, so I think she has prepared a wonderful lunch. So Well, landscape-based solutions for biocultural diversity. It's a very important topic in that regard. Because we face many issues, urbanization, loss of biodiversity, climate change, etc., etc. So many of you are involved in how to address these issues in a future-oriented way. How can we make the world better? And what we see is many good solutions in a way, technically sound, but then what we get is this kind of environments in uniformity and standard solutions. And then the question is, how can we do it better? Because this is not adding, or this is actually adding to the challenges we have. Because you can say, this is a green environment, but is it biodiversity, or is it ecology, or is it just like the green desert, you can say? On the other hand, you see also like one of the, I think from an urban design perspective, successful examples on how to adapt to the climate, how to store water, etc. But is this the type of environment we like to live in? So these are the questions we want to address, not only as a university, but also I think many of you are involved in that kind of thinking. On the other hand, we see great initiatives, building with nature, nature-based solutions, where the focus is more on, let's say, using nature as a formative element. But then sometimes we forget, let's say, the cultural component. And even we can consider it to become more like a technical solution. So I've been to many conferences and then I hear engineers say, okay, we plant some trees, we have a wadi in there, and then we have nature-based solutions. But is this really where it is about? So, and therefore we thought maybe it's better to not talk about nature-based solution, but about landscape-based solutions. And landscape, when we revert to the word landscape, there's not only this, the natural part of the coin, and there's also this cultural part in there, because landscapes are the result of the action and interaction of humans with their environment. So in a way, when you use the word landscape, people are involved. And then the question is, how can we work with this notion in an instrumental way, a future-oriented way? And therefore, we think that we should take the landscape as the basis. I think many of you know this layer cake model, but what it expresses is that we should take nature and landscape as the basis for societal development. And then, of course, we should take society as the basis for our economy. And nowadays we actually see that it is the other way around. So we have economy shaping society, and then in the end, nature is shaped into that form. But as we know, nature also strikes back, as we see in many cases all across the globe, especially in this time of uncertainty when it comes down to climate change. So we actually don't know exactly how natural systems behave. And therefore, it's very important to also work with localized knowledge. It also means that we should connect a more research view to a more designerly view. And therefore, we are very happy to be here at this faculty to combine these two worlds. So a solid knowledge base, but at the same time also creativity and collaborating with all kinds of stakeholders into the future to understand actually what the challenges are, but also what the opportunities are to do things differently. And also to combine long-term and short-term thinking. We know politics is usually suffering from short-term disease. So we want solutions and we want to have it shortly, within 5 years or less. But of course, we know that it is not possible. So we should work on this longer-term perspective. And therefore, this transdisciplinarity is also very important. Because when you look at landscape, it's a world of diversity. So here you see a geology map of the world, and every color is representing a different geological formation with its own behavior, you can say, its own conditions for natural systems to evolve, for people to relate to this environment. Also, when you look to this traditional local architecture, so what can we learn from that? It's really amazing. And I think later we will see some nice examples as well, how local people adapt to these circumstances in a harmonious way, and also add something to these systems, which make both worlds thrive, you can say. So also when you have this harmonious interaction between humans with the environment, usually you also increase biodiversity. There are many, added value to that. On the other hand, we have to realize that landscape is a living system, as very nicely expressed by this mapping of the Mississippi. Here you see the behavior of a river system over the course of centuries. And it reminds us that nature is changing all the time. Landscapes are changing all the time. And that's a little bit different than, at least here in this institution, we sometimes think about landscape. So that we can fixate river systems by dikes and water machinery. And nowadays we come to the conclusion, actually, we should do it in a different way, in a more adaptive way. But how do we do that? And therefore, it's also very important to understand that we also have a lot of stewards of the landscape in local communities. Here we see in the east of the Netherlands, people reactivating traditional water meadows in order to recharge the groundwater. But it also helps to build communities and to build new landscapes. So it's not only kind of museal activity. So we put a fence around it and we put someone there to do a performance or something. No, it's real-time working with the local circumstances and build and prepare these landscapes for the future. So it's not, in that regard, it is also a cultural expression, and it is also an expression of care and continuity. And I also wish us as future-oriented and minded people that we do more about that, so that it is not only about technology, it's not only for the people, but also for nature. It's about a symbiosis, you can say, between these worlds. And therefore, we coined this idea of landscape-based solutions. So we also draft a small paper about it with a big team, also with Liliane, but also Nico and Rosa de Wolf, elaborating a little bit on how we can work with that. So landscape-based solutions focus on co-creating and regenerating living landscape systems in which this biocultural diversity, traditional knowledge and multifunctionality lead to this more socially and ecological, water-sensitive urban landscape. So it's a whole mouthful, I understand that. But it is good to think about what these elements are. And maybe now is not the time to really get into the depth of that. But if you want, you can just scan the QR code and read a little bit more about it. And I think also later in the roundtable discussion, we will touch upon many of these elements. So in a way, this also fits into a tradition which moves from not only people-oriented approaches to more nature-oriented approaches. It's about this harmony between these different elements. Landscape approaches, you can say, where these things are positioned next to each other. And as you can see, my dear colleague Gazul from Wageningen University, he made this wonderful scheme in order to express this development. And I think from a scientific point of view, it's very important to realize that we are part of this movement. Yeah, then of course, I would like to introduce the idea of landscape logic. Landscape logic is really about an understanding of the landscape where the substrate, the abiotic conditions, the climate is influencing the biological world, you can say, the vegetation, but also the people living there. And I think the first person, how to say, acknowledging this relationship in this very nice form was, of course, von Humboldt. And therefore, I think we need to work more with this kind of landscape logic, which recognize this landscape-based system approaches. So when you have a problem downstream, that you actually need to look in the upper parts of the river system already. And what's very interesting, when you look to traditional and indigenous communities, actually they manage their territory in that way. So maybe they called it in a different way, but they had this understanding: when we do something in a certain part of the system, it will have its effects. And so, of centuries of lessons learned, they came to some interesting insights on how to work with the water system, how to work with the ecosystems, how to deal with the climate. And therefore we think it is a very nice, clue to get into the challenges of nowadays, and to also bring in this more traditional knowledge on how to deal with them. Yeah, and then of course, Julia is here with her wonderful, inspiring books. But of course, there are also other scholars in the world decades ago, starting with this understanding, making these wonderful catalogs. And all of these works actually express how indigenous and local knowledge systems have shaped and sustained resilient landscapes and ecosystems. So actually, when we look closely to all of these works and the knowledge hidden in there, we can really learn a great deal. And then when we combine it with our contemporary knowledge and our design thinking, we can really start to make a change. Also, a couple of years ago, we were together with Partners for Water at the COP16 in Colombia, where this was also the main theme of our pavilion. And in that pavilion, we received many people from across the globe, also indigenous tribe heads with special translators, in order to really start to understand on how they understand their environment and how they deal with that. So for us, it was really an eye-opening event, and I'm still very grateful that we were able to interact with this local people. And ever since, we started to build a kind of catalog of elements related to ethnobotany, water management, climate regulation, and we start to organize them according to different climatic zones. And during that event and in the months after that, we collected and received many other examples of that. So at this moment, we are working on a book, and hopefully by the end of this year or beginning next year, we will have a nice overview. But of course, it's very nice to have such an overview. It's also very important to know how this knowledge is transferred by these people, because we have this kind of typical Western view to knowledge transfers, for instance, in terms of map making in traditional ways. But what we learned there is that also performance cartography and material cartography are even more important to transform and to transition this knowledge to future generations. So it also helps us to understand alternative ways of understanding. And in this case, this indigenous mapping and ancestral cartography were very important. But of course, we are also are designers, so it's very interesting to have this kind of overviews. But in the end of the day, then the question is, okay, what can we do with it? Because we are not anthropologists or something. Of course, it's very nice to have this overview, but to put it into a forward perspective. So therefore, we started also to make an inventory of successful projects across the globe where these landscape-based solutions were very important in regenerating natural systems, but also creating new livelihoods in a contemporary way. So putting this traditional knowledge in combination with contemporary knowledge into a future perspective. And if you look into each of these examples, and there are many more, I can tell you, so they are really wonderful. And then the question is, what can we learn from that? Also here in Delft, we have some endeavors in that direction to deepen these things out. For instance, the work of Inge Bobbink on circular water storage, on how we can make use of these traditional water systems in a contemporary perspective. We have Nico working on mangrove redevelopments in his urban ecology lab in Indonesia. We have some students or PhD students working on real-time questions in Karachi, how we can have this more landscape-based approach to groundwater recharge. We have a PhD focusing on language in Bangladesh, on what we can learn from that and how we can translate that in spatial design principles, and so on. So also here together with my dear colleague from Leiden University, we also bring in this kind of ethnobotanical knowledge into the perspective of the change of landscape. And I hope maybe beginning next year or in the course of next year, we will have a nice display also in Naturalis to show this interesting relationship. So in short, there are many interesting initiatives going on where we like to build upon. So when you come here, you maybe suspect it's only technology and technical oriented people, but we also would like to bring in this more social cultural aspect. Yeah, and of course now you think, now the time has come to Julia, and indeed, but I thought it was still important to have this introduction. So, but without further ado, I would like to invite Julia to come to the stage and to provide us this lecture. And indeed, she's an author, as you know, and she's a designer. She's a global advocate for indigenous ecological knowledge. I don't have to tell you about that. She is the best-selling author of Lo-TEK, designed by radical indigenism. Lo-TEK Water recently published a field guide for technology. She's a landscape architect from Harvard. She also has taught at several institutions like Columbia and Harvard itself. And yeah, her work, and it was not a surprise to me, her work is inspired by travel across the globe and a lifelong mission to uplift ancestral technologies through storytelling. She also co-founded the Lo-TEK Institute and launched the Living Earth curriculum and co-leads the Lo-TEK Office of Intercultural Urbanism. Well, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. So usually I would begin with acknowledgements of First Nations communities, but today I'm just going to acknowledge TU Delft, going to acknowledge Steffen and Liana and Inga from Circular Water Stories. 4 of her students were actually really critical in assisting with developing research and chapters that were published in Lo-TEK Water. So there's deep connections happening all around. And I'm a little envious of the incredible amount of depth and engagement with this topic that you have here. And I hope we can, in the US, start to adopt this level of engagement as well. But I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for coming to share some time. And let me talk to you a little bit about Lo-TEK. So we're going to begin today with myth, which it comes from the ancient Greek word mythos. Its meaning is the story of the people. And just like lighthouses, myths have guided mankind for millennia. And one of the oldest mythological threads that's common to most Indigenous communities around the world is that, sounds pretty simple, but humans are part of nature, but so are our technologies. And this is the living bridges of the Kasi. It's pretty familiar at this point in time. There was a picture on the cover and on the back cover of the first book. And I did get an email from the photographer saying, thank you so much for putting it on the book. It has just gone around the world. And this living bridges, they're grown in by the Wakasi people in Northeast India. There's about 80 of these bridges in existence. They grow single level, double decker, triple decker. They're under construction. A grandfather will start by planting 2 trees, ficus trees on either side of a river. They will then create a bamboo bridge, and then they will take the secondary root systems, these really fine roots that are hanging from sort of the first level of boughs of the tree, and they'll train them through these, they cut the bamboo in half, and so almost like these soil beds, and they'll put soil in, and these vines or their root systems will grow, and eventually they grow across to the other side of the river. They're planted into the river, and this incredible process happens whereby when the root systems are touching one another, their vascular systems become engaged and they become one. And so these true trees over time become one living system, and they're engaged with the earth on either side of the river. They provide transport. So in the rainy season, you can walk across the river because these are the only bridges that can withstand the force of the monsoonal rains that just flood rapidly down into this landscape. And I just... Can you still hear me? Yeah, there we go. And anyway, I got a little sidetracked because I just think this is... I've been here and I've hugged these trees, and they're just so thick, these members as they cross the river, and then you hit them, you knock them, and they resonate, like, because there's water, it's living tissue, it's growing. They last hundreds of years in this landscape. And they're a fascinating and incredible community to work with as well, who I've worked with for like the last 7 years. But getting back to Indigenous communities and this idea of humans being connected to nature. So one really interesting fact is that many Indigenous communities, they don't even have a word for nature. They don't identify in their language nature because there's not a disconnection from humanity. So they don't identify themselves outside of it. And so this word doesn't even exist. And so they don't have this separation. They have this really integral connection. And it's kind of this elegant dance that has been created over thousands of years of kinship and caretaking. But about 400 years ago, and this is my framework that I work with, and is not, the penultimate source of understanding, but this is how I engage. Intellectuals of the European Enlightenment, they constructed a myth. This is why we're talking about myths. And this myth, it separated humans from nature. And it said that our technologies are also separate. And this modern mythology of technology, it was really fueled by fire and the felling of forests and the extraction of resources, and it powered the age of industrialization. And then out of this mythology, also what emerged was the design of the city as a machine. And that was the guiding legacy of industrial modernity. And so this new mythology, in this idea that we are going to live in machines, in our cities, and this is how they function, it also said that Indigenous knowledge is primitive and it is unsophisticated and it would be ignored. And it replaced within that engagement the traditional role that Indigenous communities and many traditional communities around the world have had as this idea of caretaking and kinship with the environments that we live in. And it replaced that with this idea that we are controllers, that we are meant to dominate. And inevitably, that has come to become, we are destroyers. And many, many people have this ideology that human beings put in an environment will be destructive. That is just what we do. If you speak to an Indigenous community or traditional communities, they'll say that that's never been our role. We are the ones who foster connection. We are the ones who build interconnectivity. We are the critical engagements The earth needs us and we need the earth. It is this reciprocal relationship. Many communities call this like mana, this energetic relationship that's always in circularity. And so this is the flip that happened. And then to understand how this idea of the city as a machine, it took place spatially, it took shape spatially, then we can turn to modernism. And when Louis Sullivan, he said, form follows function. And this happened in the late 19th century. It was revolutionary. It said, from our buildings, we will strip ornament, and our cities, they're going to be designed to mirror the efficiency of machines. And our cities were imagined these engines of innovation. And they're powered by coal and steel and this industrial ambition. But today we see that experiment mostly failed. And it gave us forms that function, but very, very rarely these forms that actually thrive. And cities became very rigid. They became mechanical. They became extractive. And they exhaust their ecosystems, they displace cultures, they displace wetlands, they bury rivers. We can go on and on about the impacts that cities have to the communities that live within them. And so what we can say modernism gave in order, it completely lost in its understanding of life. And so we find ourselves here. And this is why we speak about this experiment of modernism failing. Is because we are in this time of upheaval, and we really have to say that this form follows function. Maybe this needs to change. Maybe the underpinnings of modernity, we need to shift this. And so form can follow flux. And that means that what we design have to be responsive, that it has to be adaptive. It has to be in flux and being able to work with the adaptive conditions of cultures, of environments, of water, and of ecosystems. So this is the Kutnat. This is a really interesting, it's called sort of the Netherlands of the South. It's a subsea level farming system. And so in a similar way, they're farming subsea level. But what's very interesting is that this system actually adapts seasonally. So it's not blocking the water with a huge dike and allowing just one type of water, fresh water, to engage within their farming agricultural system. It allows salt water. And so seasonally, it's shifting between salt water and fresh water, and therefore its food systems are also shifting between salt water and fresh water. And so this is the types of adaptations that we're speaking about when we're talking about these traditional knowledge systems. There we go. So this is also one prediction of what we're facing. So I presented at the World Design Conference in, I think, October last year, and I was sandwiched between Thomas Heatherwick and Lord Foster, which was a very interesting kind of position to lecture on this. But I thought it was really interesting that Foster said in one of his talks that each year until 2040, 11 cities the size of London will be built, 160. This is pretty much up on the very higher spectrum of the scale of the speed of urbanization and global population growth. But I don't know if anyone just saw an article that came out that they said they think that the world population has been undercounted by billions the other day. So these systems are unpredictable. And so we're entering one of the largest urban transformations that we've ever seen in human history. And one that will determine whether cities and the systems they depend on and the industrial value chains that shape them, because they're also really important, whether they remain these engines of extraction or whether they shift and they become regenerative and more aligned with ecological intelligence. And so what we're really asking here, what I'm really interested in understanding is, what if the models for this transition, they already exist? And what if the technologies that are capable of shaping these post-carbon futures that are emerging and these pre-extractive or post-extractive, post-industrial, place-based systems that have been refined over millennia from cultural knowledge and adaptations to climate extremes, what if they're in an incredible position of co-design and engagement to shape our understanding if we are to value that knowledge and to allow the knowledge holders to lead in the engagement of that knowledge. And so Indigenous technologies, they are not relics of the past. They are living systems. They're capable of shaping the future of urbanism, of infrastructure, and of industry. And so this is the Chinapa system. These are constructed agricultural islands. They're not floating. A lot of people think they are floating. They form the foundation of the pre-colonial Mexica city that was where Mexico City sits now. It was a city that it was called Tenochtitlan. It was 200,000 permanent inhabitants with a tribute of 5 million people. And it is understood, or it is generally understood, that this city was greater than the density of New York City. Highly dense, growing its food systems. And we'll talk a little bit more about this system later, because this system wasn't erased. It actually still exists in Mexico City. So these systems are the foundation of Lo-TEK. And Lo-TEK is a framework that redefines technology through the intelligence of ancestral knowledge. So 2019, I published this book, Lo-TEK, Designed by Radical Indigenism, and it was really just questioning whether some of the oldest, most sophisticated, and most sustainable ecological technologies on Earth, why these systems have been excluded from education systems, from urban design, and from our production cycles. And my thinking was inspired by this philosophy. I always also want to acknowledge Fikret Burke's and Sacred Ecology, because his work was really something that inspired me very, very early on in my research. But I was really, for radical indigenism, looking to this Professor Eva Marie Groot. She is a citizen of the nation. She recognized that Indigenous communities are actually already rebuilding their knowledge bases through looking at ancestral knowledge and looking through histories to deal with contemporary crisis and to deal with conditions that they're facing today. And so Lo-TEK, with this mic, Lo-TEK has since then evolved into what I think is a global post-carbon design movement, which indicates that we're really approaching, I think, this cultural tipping point. And that is a transition from industrial modernity, which works against ecology, towards living systems that are designed with it. And I think that from the presentation today and from being here, I'm even more sure that this is where we're sitting right now. This is this tipping point we're sitting at. But I think perhaps the emerging story of this century is the city as a cultural ecosystem. And it's not less advanced, it's more adaptive, it's more responsive, and it's more alive. And this is a future where nature becomes the architect and culture becomes the engineer. And so now, with some of the most imminent threats, and this is the reason why I wrote a book about water, because of this idea that water is such a threat to humanity, and I really wanted to look at how Indigenous communities, who are often on the front line of the impact of water, how they contextualize a perceived threat of water. They don't actually talk about water as a threat. They talk about it as a mother, as kin, as the ocean, as the amniotic fluid of the planet. And so water is really to try and explore, well, how are these solutions really evolving in the context of traditional and Indigenous knowledge systems today? But also what came out of water was there's a global phenomenon that's happening around the world where communities are working with designers and scientists and academics to co-design and take their knowledge systems and evolve them. And it's not that these knowledge systems are fixed in time and preserved like a cultural anthropological artifact. Communities are evolving their technologies, they're building Sometimes the technologies stay the same way they have been for thousands of years. They're just combating new types of environmental crises. Sometimes the technologies are being adapted with new types of material technologies to form technologies we've never seen before. And in some cases, which I'll show you these today, cities are actually building ancestral knowledge systems in the way that they deal with water to create new models that are being replicated all over the globe. So we can see that ancestral knowledge is actually this global phenomenon of being built into shaping how we are designing cities and systems and sites and landscapes across the globe. And this still remains something that is very, very, very little talked about. And that's what this book is trying to uplift. And so it's really documenting this new class of post-extractive climate, TEK, technologies that are emerging across the planet. And so after years spent researching and illustrating and co-authoring these 2 compendiums, because we do all of this work in the studio, what emerged was a really different understanding of urbanism itself. And within the context of urbanism, I talk about urbanism as a sort of the transformation of communities and their engagement with landscapes. So we're not saying that it's just in urban environments. These can be peri-urban, rural, island. We're talking about this sort of transformations that are occurring. And that is where ancestral intelligence is really informing cities, infrastructures, and industries. And so this, at the very end of water, which I have here, they were very upset with me because it was 150 pages longer than my contract. And they said, Julia, you have to stop. No more chapters. I said, okay. But at the very end, there's a section called Future Directions. And we wrote that at the very end because what I understood from some of the feedback of some of the readers is, well, how do we start to shape cities? And how do we bring all these lessons learned together? Because we have these case studies, we have these projects, so we understand inspiration and implementation. What are the guidelines? And so this is an attempt to try and understand these principles. And how do we begin to, in the context of 165 cities in the next 15 years, how do we start to shape the future development of those? And so these principles, they range from, and this is a series of projects in the background that I've done in my studio over the last 12 years that I won't go into, but these have been tried and tested as implementation. So they range from spiritual, mythological, and cultural continuity, which, working here in Bali, we were looking at geospatial, cosmological, and relational worldviews, what exists on this island for thousands of years, and an understanding of spiritual landscapes is actually protecting soil systems, forest systems, and all of the larger watershed systems. And so these are really important in understanding how to design cities in contexts where these types of landscapes are still in existence, where we're going to see this urbanization occurring. To collective governance, co-design, and commons-based resource management, to ancestral technologies as innovation, whereas landscape designers, we can start thinking about how do we design spaces, material technologies. If we want a performance like water cleansing, how do we use our material geographies to clean the water that we're collecting, surface water, just through what the composition of our paving systems? How do we combine all these systems together? To Indigenous multi-species urbanism, landscape architects, if we have some in the room. Any in the room? Can we put our hands up? Okay, we have a couple. So we know that with native species planting, this is number one and what we try to do in cities, but we can go so far beyond that to try and enable native food systems, and then understand, and maybe sometimes in some contexts these systems are engaged and sometimes it's not so relevant in different localities, but how these systems then feed into the food sovereignty or the food cycles of our cities. And I'll show you some places where that's happening. To bio-based materials and bioclimatic architecture. All of these systems, I will say, we look at systems from the molecular to the material, to the modular, to the system, to the infrastructure. And what's beautiful about I think is really beautiful about these systems is like the Madan, they have a single species of reed that they grow. 6,500 years they lived in the southern wetlands of Iraq. That single species of reed, they make everything out of that. They make islands, they make houses. These islands stay afloat for 25 years. In their houses, they create columns in tension. They create rafters, beams, they weave it, and then they make it into rope. And that rope binds the building because they don't have any way to fix the buildings. So the material logics, and the number one thing that I think is that they make islands. So they're using the material performance of rot and decomposition, which in architecture we're like, stay away from that. That's the most terrible thing that we can have. But they use that opportunistically. And they say, well, we want this to rot because it creates buoyancy. And then we live on that buoyancy and we rely on that relationship of buoyancy to stay afloat, but it also cleans the water underneath us. So the intelligence of these systems, from its material logics all the way up to the sort of bioclimatic architecture that creates, is incredibly profound. I missed one. Water-centered urban planning and living systems and cultural infrastructures. I think you have an incredible example of this in the city, and probably I have a deeper understanding than many. And then industrial symbiosis and regenerative production, and regenerative water, energy, and waste systems. And so that kind of might sound very technical, but this is deeply embedded in so many of these systems. But I'm going to show you a project which is not in the context of an Indigenous community, it's in the context of a corporation. Next. Because I was working with a corporation, and it was the best brief I'd ever been given. It was during the pandemic, and they said, make our corporation, a global corporation, Lo-TEK. And I was working with their innovation sector, so sort of 20 years out from market or from application, 5 to 20 years. And so I started looking at, well, what is industrial symbiosis? And you have industrial symbiosis and examples close by, and perhaps in the city. It's a Scandinavian model of how you could create industrial sectors where your waste residue cycles are all correlative, and spatially your systems are designed to have that co-location engagement. So now I'm going to move and sort of give an example, because these principles actually began with this project, which was from about 4 years ago. And I was working, you can probably figure out who I was working for, but the question at the time there was, how do we make this, what would we do if we were to ever make this company Lo-TEK? And I said, this is a really interesting question. What would you do? Should we look at your value chain? Is that where we could shift? Because in a lot of ways they're saying, well, we can work with the Nature Conservancy, we can do these partnerships. And I said, but maybe partnerships at this time, this is incredible, yes, but maybe there's a way to relate to community and uplift community, and to value community knowledge and to think about from that perspective. And so we said, well, we can look at the material, because you're creating something. It's pretty obvious what you're creating. But what if we don't just look at the material in what we're designing? What if we think about the system that we're designing? And that system involves industry, it involves urbanism, it involves ecology, it involves culture. And so in this engagement, we said, okay, kelp is our provocation. Let's think about what kelp might do, a bio-based material that is one of the fastest growing living materials on the planet, performs incredibly, sequesters carbon, regenerates biodiversity. What if we think about that transforming production from extraction to cultivation? And then we looked at what was happening in this landscape, and we said, well, your materials that you engage with, they don't simply flow, they actually map, and every single supply chain, it carries an incredible environmental, but also a cultural geography associated with it. And that geography is shaped by extraction. It's shaped by energy, transportation, and the production. And so what we were doing, we were tracing these material geographies, and obviously what it revealed is these really dispersed flows that are incredibly disconnected from both their communities and both their ecosystems where they originate. So in response, what we designed or what we proposed and imagined was these resilient local networks, materials that are grown and regenerated and exchanged through very hyper-local supply chains. And so the future of production that we began to imagine was cultural and hyper-local. And I will say that we were always working with communities who were part of market economy. So we weren't working with communities that were outside market economies where supply chains or supplies would be compromising localized conditions. We were working with communities that were already in existence and working within market economies. But we were proposing that you could have these cultural hyper-local supply chains from sea to city, and that we would start where this community already exists, integrating these regenerative production loops. So kelp farming, feeding material streams, and local fabrication, reducing waste streams, Indigenous infrastructures, supporting climate resilience. And that was key, that climate resilience had to be supported with these types of supply chains. And so kelp being grown and the kelp industry being expanded in an area where it had just been decimated, where it once existed as the kelp highway up the west coast of the United States, trying to build the foundation of that underwater forest back. And the reason was to create a supply chain of a new biomaterial. And so we imagined that the supply chains would actually be transformed in these biocultural networks with nature as the architect and culture as the engineer. We began by looking at a very specific spot called Otter Rock and envisioned this first Pacific living lab. And that linked the kelp restoration. It linked aquaculture that was in existence. It linked the coastal craft traditions of the Siletz community and their stewardship models that are already in existence. And that is a part of their internal community building. And then scaling out, we began to ask, well, what happens if there can be a relationship to support global traditional mariculture around the world, and that we could start to generate hyperlocal innovation and regenerative production, imagining sort of a more non-extractive and post-industrial production model where we would have these sister cities where kelp is already an incredible part of the economy, and there would be a sharing of ecological knowledge, regenerative practices, and biocultural production. And so because we know that this company really likes these taglines, we said, all right, one of the things we need is a bit of a cultural shift as well. So we said, well, what if this idea of the win-win-win? And the win-win-win actually comes from gaming theory. And we adopted this non-zero-sum system, proposing the win-win-win. And what that means is you work on collaborative advantage. And so you understand the advantage of working in collaboration, of having multi-stakeholder relationships to build the bioeconomy that you need to supply your productive value chain. And so this idea that you can go further working in collaboration rather than competition, where this regenerative model replaces extraction. And so not industry as machine, but industry as ecosystem. But now in the built environment, which we're incredibly connected to, because underpinning so much of the built environment, we have these systems at play and they might not be seen, but they're felt. They're felt in the impact of climate change. But designers like myself and like many of you, we're really restricted by specifications. And those specifications tell us how we should build. And so Lo-TEK Water, I tried to take a bit of a different approach. And I said, well, what if water was the one actually writing all those specifications and telling us how we should be thinking? And that created these technology or tech specifications. And really simply, they are living, co-evolutionary, co-energetic, symbiotic, and cyclical, thinking about the performance of these types of technologies. And so for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to quickly go through some of this. I'll show you 5 different examples through these different specs. So living. So for their entire material life cycles, these technologies are composed of really complex, responsive, and emergent patterns of interactions between organisms and their environment. That's a very long-winded way of saying they're alive. And so this is an example from the Pacific Northwest, the coastal Salish community of the Swinomish. What they're doing here is they're building a 200-meter clam garden. It's an intertidal terrace. It's the first intertidal terrace that's been built in the United States in 400 years. This revitalization of building clam gardens actually began up north in Canada, but they're teaching communities in the south how to start to regenerate these types of infrastructures. And they're doing this not for food sovereignty, which was the traditional reason they would grow these systems. They're doing it to mitigate the impact of climate change and tidal events and storm surge and erosion of shoreline conditions. And so what it's doing is it's forming the base of this seaside terrace, and it's reviving this nature-based technology that they actually had been building and remodeling the entire coastline with for 4,000 years until colonization stopped any of this in this intertidal zone, any sort of adaptation or transformation. So they're increasing shellfish production, they're boosting biodiversity, and they're mitigating new climate challenges. This is radical indigenism, looking at old knowledge, old technologies to invent new types of technologies to deal with conditions that we're facing today. On the other side of the United States, we have a model of coevolutionary. And so coevolutionary means that this system has survived and evolved, often survived in the face of complete decimation, and for communities, pretty apocalyptic conditions that have occurred, but it's survived alongside generations. And it's done that by using limited resources, looking at material geographies and adapting to those environmental conditions in real time, meaning that they're co-evolutionary. The community wouldn't exist without this technology, and the technology would not exist without the community. And so just 2 hours from my home in New York City, that's where this system sits. It's a 6th-generation women's kelp farming initiative, and they have been actually, for the last couple hundred years, they weren't able to practice this, but they've been living here and practicing kelp farming with sugar kelp for 13,000 years. And that is a relationship that they have established with the sea and seaweed, and I do it for coastal remediation today. It's the first Indigenous-run kelp farm on the entire of the East Coast. And so this is the Shinnecock kelp farmers, and they're doing this for food sovereignty, for ecological restoration, but it's also for community building as well, which is a really important part of engaging with knowledge systems. It's improving the water quality. The reason they're doing that is because Shinnecock Bay is so polluted from underground polluted water systems, from industrial agriculture and water running out of the watershed into the bay. And they're supporting biodiversity. It's sequestering carbon. It's also become a new way of generating income for this community, because they're harvesting this and then they're selling it back to the farmers, and they're displacing synthetic fertilizers. So they're actually making an impact in the value chain. So that translation of impacting value chain with biomaterials is at play within this system. So co-energetic, as I mentioned, these are incredibly opportunistic TEK technologies, and they're activated by really sustainable and non-exploitive practices and processes, or really dynamic flows. That just means they are co-energetic. So this is a system in Bangkok. This is the Thammasat University building. It's a 22,000 square meter rooftop that forms terracing. And there's a whole lot of really young designers in Thailand who are looking at that ancestral systems, they're terracing, and saying, how do we adapt our cities that once worked with water and are incredibly well adapted to work with water, but we cut off all the water connections in our cities. And they're rebuilding cities and systems and buildings to understand how to engage with those water cycles once again. So this is designed by Land Process. As you see, it's a series of rice terraces. It's at the university. They're growing the food that they're selling in the cafeteria. The students are harvesting all this food. I mean, all of the wonderful bioclimatic impacts of engaging with water cycles and collection of water and water infiltration and cooling the surrounding environment, sequestering carbon, but also they're feeding their community. They're collecting all the water and using it for all of their irrigation within this building system. And the entire building is actually running on renewable energy. So it's forming this food, water, energy nexus, which is the FAO, understanding like they're creating a building that's inherently sustainable based on this ancestral knowledge. So you might understand that what I'm trying to show is how these systems are being integrated into contemporary design today. So they're symbiotic. So what they do is they create conditions for interspecies exchanges, and then they rely on those conditions to keep on functioning in perpetuity. And so this is an image of Mexico City, pre-colonial Mexico City from 1325 to 1521, which I mentioned before, which had this really dense urban population that was working in harmony with a system of 5 lakes that was actually sited within. So while most of the city, what the conquistadors did when they came to Mexico, they said, okay, we're going to cut off all your water supplies. So they cut off all the canals and the aqueducts that had traveled all the water into the city. The entire lake system went dry, and they put in a European model of a city on top of that. Now we see Mexico City is water scarce, there's droughts, there's floods. It's very vulnerable because of the types of conditions of this template of industrial modernity. And so what happened, though, is part of this system remained in the south of the city. It's called the Chiapas, and they're agricultural islands, not floating, often published as floating, not. They are built up in a lake bed that's about 1.5 to 5 meters deep. It's not that deep. It's quite shallow, and they build these up, and then they surround them with sacred willow trees, and then they plant them. What's really interesting about these systems is the abundance of food that comes out of it. So there's 8 harvests a year in general, and the city, the soil in this system, in its natural state, is highly alkaline, which is not conducive at all to growing agriculture. So they have actually adapted the soil to be an almost Amazonian terra preta soil, a really rich, dense, nutrient rich soil. And they're providing 8 harvests per year from these systems. Now they're saying to mitigate these systems, and you can see these are all islands. If you go back to this image, what looks like roads is canals. So there's primary canals, there's secondary canals. This is like your city, but canals everywhere. And really small islands are actually conditioned to the width of how you could easily water all your plants on the island. And so they still have this, they're still growing the food. A lot of the food is now actually providing food for very high-end restaurants in Mexico City through collaboratives like Acatierra, if anyone is interested in understanding where this connection of food is coming from. But this system does more than food. It cleans the water. Imagine it's cleaning about 1/5 of the wastewater that's coming out of Mexico City. It's lowering the ambient air temperatures. They predict if you were to remove this part of in the south, this Chiapas, you would see a rise of your ambient air temperature by 5 to 7 degrees. And it's protecting from flood and drought. So this is an infrastructure versus ecology. It's both of those things intertwined together. And so when we're talking about the future of cities, I think it's really important to remember to allow cities to remember, and to understand that the answers aren't always in these new technologies. It's also about remembering the old. And so this is the last one, but there's a little bit to go after this. But this is cyclical. So cyclical just means triggered by the repetition of the sun rising and setting, days, seasons, years. I think what's really interesting about cyclical and what we talk about in the book is that renewable energy is also working on cyclical cycles. And you'll notice that some of these types of nature-based systems, the ancestral systems, are actually now co-locating with renewable energy technologies. In the Czech Republic, there's a system called the Trebon, which is Rybnik and Prikop canals. And that system is co-located with biodigesters and new types of renewable energy systems. So there is a really incredible relationship that is evolving there as well. So this is a system that's in China. It's not the Chinapas, that's a mistake. This is called the Sanjiotang. It's in the Yangtze Delta, and it's a system of dikes that are planted with mulberry trees. So these are ponds, dikes, and canals, and all the dikes are actually planted with mulberry trees. And farmers are growing fish. This is an incredible aquaculture system, vegetables, and then this is the land and water actually working together. But it's doing it in a very cyclical way because, I'll go back here, just briefly explain it. So the mulberry trees are silkworms, and the silkworms in the mulberry trees they defecate, and that goes into the water, into the ponds. And there's a relationship of eating that waste by the fish, and then the fish and the pooping into the bottom of the pond. And then once a year, they'll drain the system, or they'll drain the system annually, and then they'll scoop all of that sludge at the bottom of those ponds, and they'll put that on the embankments. And then the sludge actually feeds as fertilizer for the mulberry trees, forming this really cyclical relationship. But again, what else does this system do? It prevents flood from the city of Huzhou. So it's incredible, and it's actually embedded with within a much larger infrastructure of canals that is preventing flood as well. But what I wanted to get to is that this model of sponge city, this is one of the most well-known models of water management, urban water management that we have on the planet, one of the most advanced models. It's actually developed using ancestral knowledge systems and contemporary design. So Kong Jianyu, the late Kong Jianyu, late and brilliant, he came up with this model for Sponge City, which has been replicated in almost 100 cities around the globe. And he was designing cities that were once expelling water, and that's what their design was, to get rid of water as fast as they could, to actually keep water and to absorb it. And to learn to live with that again, he was looking at the Chinapa in Mexico City and the Sanjiotang and looking at those ancestral systems and then building that knowledge into the creation of Sponge City. So Sponge City is the manifestation of this ideology of Lo-TEK and radical indigenism. And that came out actually talking to him in an interview for the book. And he was like, oh yeah, I've never really spoken about that. And after the interview, he started to talk about how the ancestral knowledge was really shaping the design, which is important to sort of uplift the knowledge and talk about it and its value if you're a designer and you're engaging with the knowledge. And so these types of landscapes in cities, he was observing how the farmers were working with water and creating ponds and terraces and embankments, and then how those embankments would store and filter and move water with seasons. And so he created Sanya Mangrove Park. The previous one was Nanyang Fishtail Park. And this, what you can see here, was once complete concrete flood zone. What they created was this. It's this living estuary, and there's mangroves that are planted all throughout that are filtering the water systems, and the landforms are actually acting like a sponge to store the water when it floods. And so Sponge City is as hybridized in ancestral intelligence and contemporary design. And it's forming the most important, I think, water urbanism of the century. And so when I interviewed him, he really spoke about his childhood and how these looking and watching and how that informed what his design work was. And so for me, what he was speaking about, it really raised a much bigger question. And in the context of a university, it's something that we really have to talk about, is that, what becomes when possible when ancestral intelligence is introduced early enough to actually shape the imagination of a generation. Because we could speak about it in the context of practitioners who've been doing these types of nature-based solutions for the last 15 years, and we are the experts, but getting that mind shift to happen and the application and implementation, that's tough. But if this is how you understand your education, then that relationship is innate. So I want to quickly introduce you to the Institute. So we actually operate under the mythology of technology, that humans are part of nature. And that mythology, that's been excluded nearly across the globe from our educational systems because of industrialization. So if you think that our systems were based, our education was based on that idea of separation. So we're trying to train in a way that our education systems are not established for as well. So that actually at the Institute, that's been our lighthouse, that's been our guide. So it's guided the creation of two different curriculums. We had the Living Earth and the Living Water. And they're both based on the book, two different books. And it's trying to build education that is looking at ancestral nature-based solutions to inform and cultivate planetary literacy for future generations. So a little bit of understanding. So last year, we worked with different global education institutions or country education institutions. So we work with Eco Schools Canada. We got the curriculum into 165 high schools in Canada, which was incredible because STEM education most often is not looking at any of these nature-based systems. Next year, we're doing a collaboration with Eco School Global. We have the opportunity to distribute now to 52,000 schools around the world. So what that means, and it's much bigger than scale, it means that we can actually acknowledge, okay, industrialization, it transformed the world because the mythology of that understanding, it became embedded in education as well as infrastructure. But what happened is it became embedded in all of our imaginations. So this idea of separation is just how we imagine. But if we look at Kong Jianyu and how he was able to create Sponge City, he didn't do it just because he was an architect. He did it because as a kid, he lived in relationship with water. And so that really early understanding, that's actually what shaped Sponge City. And so that's kind of our tipping point, but that we see that we're now in a moment where this ancestral knowledge, I think this is what the university and your projects and your curriculums are supporting as well, where ancestral knowledge is now beginning to re-enter education at a scale that is capable of reshaping generational relationships with dominant mythologies and technologies. So now we're at a point where we can actually start to see a big shift because our imaginations are going to be in tune with this understanding. And so this is Water Stories, and this is a collaboration that we announced last week, and it's alongside Brave Blue World Foundation and the World Water Film Festival. This is our open source offering, so this is why I'm showing you. You can get to this and understand it. We worked with a documentary film called Our Blue World, A Water Odyssey, that is, I think it's in 15 different languages now. But it's a documentary that actually looks at different communities around the world and the water stories coming from those communities. So we have 8 of these short clips from the documentary, and we're asking students now to trace their daily relationships with water. But the project isn't just about observation. We're inviting students to actually then submit their short films to this World Water Film Festival, and then they'll be judged and they'll be shown to a global audience. So this is what Lo-TEK has become. So we operate through 2 interconnected entities, and it's just really working towards one vision, post-carbon futures grounded in ancestral intelligence. And the Institute, we assist schools, we assist institutions, we even work with corporations. We work with Aboriginal in Australia, an Aboriginal community whereby they're trying to create a swimmable river, but they want to understand where around the world are other communities doing these types of innovations and how can we also learn from those communities. So it's also the database for the curriculum is over 90% sourced from ancestral nature-based solutions, which most curriculums, most academic literature systemically excludes oral-based education and Indigenous wisdom just by who is publishing and how they get into institutions and how they get peer-reviewed. So we're trying to bypass that cycle of of sort of disassociation. So we're really trying to understand, in this time of a really rapidly changing future, how do we embed this knowledge into the imagination of the next generation? And then the Lo-TEK Office for Intercultural Urbanism, we're really design and science. So I have a material technologist, a biochemist on the team, because these systems are built from material technologies all the way up to understanding design and the design of systems. And so the office is also co-led by Indigenous and non-Indigenous designers and scientists. We have a 20-person advisory circle. I think 18 of those persons are Indigenous designers and practitioners. And so we have this sort of knowledge engagement framework by which we work. And then we have this background of a community that helps us understand, how do we keep on working in an ethical way? So together, the office and the institute, we work across implementation and imagination. And I think it's really important that we start to build these models for co-design, for co-governance, for co-creation of the types of landscapes that can actually adapt and landscapes that we want to live in. Because coming from the first book, I always make this quote, we're drowning in this age of information or innovation while we're starving for wisdom. And I think what we really need is resilience that's just not dependent only on technological innovation. We really need radical ways of seeing and learning and designing, but we also in that need to think about whose knowledge is valued and whose knowledge gets to lead. So thank you. I'll leave you with that. And now we'll move to the panel.